In the late summer of 1867, in the fertile delta lands of southern Louisiana, a plantation owner named Marcus Blackwood began what he would later describe in his private journals as the most ambitious social and biological experiment ever conducted on American soil. For 22 years, hidden from the scrutiny of authorities and shielded by the chaos of Reconstruction, Blackwood operated what can only be described as a human laboratory, where the boundaries of medical ethics, human rights, and scientific inquiry were systematically violated in pursuit of knowledge that no moral person should have sought. When federal troops finally entered Blackwood's plantation in the spring of 1889, following reports from neighbors who had grown suspicious of the unusual activities on the property, they discovered a population of 63 individuals whose very existence challenged everything that 19th-century science understood about human genetics, development, and the limits of physical and psychological manipulation. The commanding officer's initial report, sent by urgent telegram to his superiors in New Orleans, contained just 3 words before breaking off mid-transmission, as if the officer couldn't find language adequate to describe what he had witnessed. Those 3 words were, "God help them all." The full truth of what Marcus Blackwood created on his Louisiana plantation would take months to document and decades to fully understand. The medical examinations conducted by Army physicians, the testimony of the survivors, and Blackwood's own meticulous journals revealed a systematic program of controlled breeding, experimental treatments, and psychological conditioning that had been operating continuously since 1867. What made Blackwood's experiment particularly disturbing wasn't just its scope or duration, but the cold scientific rigor with which it had been conducted. This was not the work of a madman acting on impulse, but of an educated, intelligent individual who had deliberately chosen to treat human beings as laboratory subjects in pursuit of answers to questions that should never have been asked. Before we continue with the disturbing story of Marcus Blackwood and the experiment he conducted in the Louisiana Delta, subscribe to Shadows of America and hit that notification bell. We release hour-long investigations every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Let us know in the comments what state you're watching from, and share this video with someone who appreciates deep investigations into America's darkest historical secrets. The Louisiana that Marcus Blackwood inhabited in the years following the Civil War was a place of profound social, economic, and political upheaval. The antebellum plantation system that had dominated the region for generations had been shattered by Union victory and the subsequent emancipation of 4 million enslaved people. Large landholdings were being subdivided, former slaves were attempting to establish themselves as free laborers or independent farmers, and the white planter class was struggling to adapt to a world where their primary source of wealth and power had been eliminated by federal decree. Blackwood himself came from old Louisiana money. His family had established their plantation, known as Thornfield, in 1821, building their fortune on sugarcane cultivation, worked by enslaved labor. The plantation occupied nearly 2,000 acres of prime delta land, about 30 miles south of New Orleans, in a region where the Mississippi River created a complex network of bayous, swamps, and fertile agricultural zones. Marcus had been born in 1831, the only surviving son of Jonathan and Elizabeth Blackwood, and had been groomed from childhood to eventually inherit and manage the family property. Unlike many of his planter class peers, Marcus Blackwood had received a sophisticated education. He had attended the College of Louisiana in New Orleans, studying natural philosophy and what was then called natural history, the precursor to modern biology. He had then spent 3 years in Europe, primarily in Paris and London, where he attended medical lectures and observed the latest developments in scientific research. He returned to Louisiana in 1855, filled with ideas about applying scientific methods to agricultural improvement and convinced that systematic observation and experimentation could unlock secrets about human development that traditional methods had missed. The Civil War had been financially devastating for the Blackwood family. The Union occupation of New Orleans in 1862 had disrupted their access to markets, and the subsequent emancipation had freed the 147 people that the Blackwoods had held in bondage. By 1867, Thornfield Plantation was operating with a much reduced workforce of former slaves who now worked as paid laborers, though the wages Blackwood offered were barely sufficient for survival. The social order of the antebellum South had been overturned, but in the isolated rural parishes of southern Louisiana, where federal authority was stretched thin and local white elites still controlled most aspects of daily life, it was possible for someone like Marcus Blackwood to operate with minimal outside interference. It was in this context of disruption and reduced oversight that Blackwood conceived his experiment. The exact moment of its inception can be dated with precision because Blackwood documented everything in journals that would later be discovered by federal investigators. On June 15, 1867, he wrote, "Today I have determined to undertake a systematic investigation of human inheritance and development that will answer questions that philosophers and physicians have debated for centuries. I possess the resources, the knowledge, and most importantly, the subjects necessary to conduct such research. The chaos of the current era provides an opportunity that may never come again. I must seize it, regardless of the ethical qualms that weaker minds might raise." The subjects Blackwood referred to were people, specifically the population of former slaves, who remained on his plantation, either because they had nowhere else to go, or because Blackwood offered them just enough compensation to make staying seem preferable to the uncertainty of seeking work elsewhere. In the immediate aftermath of emancipation, many freed people found themselves in desperate circumstances. Literacy was rare, capital for establishing independent farms was non-existent, and the hostility of white communities made movement and settlement difficult. Blackwood understood these vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically. His initial approach was to offer long-term labor contracts to families who would agree to remain on Thornfield Plantation for a minimum of 5 years. The contracts guaranteed basic food and housing, small cash payments, and what Blackwood described as educational opportunities for children. To people who had spent their entire lives enslaved, who had no experience with negotiating employment terms, and who faced genuine starvation if they couldn't secure work, these contracts seemed like reasonable arrangements. Nearly 30 families signed agreements with Blackwood between 1867 and 1869, binding themselves and their children to the plantation. What the contracts didn't mention, and what Blackwood had no intention of disclosing, was that he planned to use these families as subjects in a multi-generational breeding and development experiment. He wanted to test theories about human inheritance that had been debated in scientific circles for decades. Could specific traits be reliably passed from parents to children? Could selective breeding create humans with enhanced physical or mental capabilities? Could environmental factors during pregnancy or early childhood development be manipulated to produce desired characteristics? These were the questions Blackwood intended to answer through systematic experimentation on the people under his control. The earliest phase of the experiment focused on documentation and selection. Blackwood conducted thorough physical examinations of every person on the plantation, recording detailed measurements of height, weight, cranial dimensions, limb proportions, and other physical characteristics. He tested cognitive abilities through simple tasks and puzzles. He documented family histories, trying to trace inherited traits through multiple generations. All of this data was carefully recorded in journals, organized by family groups, with each individual assigned a number for tracking purposes. Based on this initial assessment, Blackwood began making decisions about controlled breeding. He identified individuals he believed possessed desirable traits and arranged marriages between them, offering financial incentives to couples who agreed to marry according to his selections. He separated couples he deemed genetically unsuitable from each other, either by assigning them to work in different parts of the vast plantation, or in some cases, by forcing divorces and reassigning people to different partners. The level of control Blackwood exercised over these intimate aspects of people's lives was extraordinary and deeply traumatic for those subjected to it. Men and women who had formed genuine emotional attachments were torn apart because Blackwood's measurements and assessments deemed them unsuitable matches. Young people reaching marriageable age found their choice of partners dictated by Blackwood's experimental protocols rather than by their own preferences or inclinations. The psychological cruelty of this system was immense, but Blackwood viewed it as necessary for maintaining experimental rigor. By 1870, Blackwood had established what he termed his breeding lines, specific family groups that he was tracking through multiple generations. He maintained separate journals for each line, documenting births, physical development, health issues, and any unusual characteristics that emerged. He was particularly interested in traits that appeared to be heritable, such as height, strength, musical ability, mathematical aptitude, and what he vaguely termed mental stability. But Blackwood's experiment went far beyond simple selective breeding. He began introducing environmental modifications designed to test whether human development could be influenced by factors during pregnancy and early childhood. Pregnant women in certain experimental groups were given special diets that Blackwood had designed based on his understanding of nutrition and development. Others were subjected to specific physical regimens, required to perform certain exercises or avoid certain activities. Children born into the experiment were raised according to different protocols, some with intensive early education, others deliberately kept isolated from intellectual stimulation. Most disturbing were the medical interventions Blackwood performed on pregnant women and newborns. He had acquired medical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies through contacts in New Orleans, obtaining substances that were being used experimentally in European medical research. Some pregnant women were given drugs intended to influence fetal development. Newborns were subjected to procedures that Blackwood believed might enhance their physical or cognitive capabilities. The details of these interventions, recorded in his medical journals with clinical detachment, revealed a complete absence of concern for the suffering he was causing or the risks he was taking with human lives. The death rate among infants in Blackwood's experimental groups was significantly higher than among the general population, though Blackwood attributed this to the natural process of selection rather than to the harm caused by his interventions. Between 1867 and 1880, at least 37 children born on Thornfield Plantation died before reaching age 5, many showing symptoms consistent with poisoning or adverse reactions to the substances Blackwood had administered. He documented these deaths with the same clinical precision he applied to everything else, noting the circumstances, symptoms, and his hypotheses about what had gone wrong, then adjusting his protocols for the next round of experiments. The people subjected to Blackwood's experiment lived in a state of constant surveillance and control. They were not permitted to leave the plantation without explicit permission. Visitors from outside were discouraged, and when federal officials or other authorities did visit, Blackwood was careful to present a facade of normal agricultural operations, hiding the experimental nature of what was occurring. The workers were housed in quarters that Blackwood had designed to facilitate his observations, with families assigned to specific locations based on their experimental group, rather than by their own preferences or by kinship ties that existed outside of Blackwood's breeding lines. Communication between different experimental groups was monitored and sometimes restricted. Blackwood wanted to prevent what he called contamination of his breeding lines, by which he meant romantic or sexual relationships that didn't conform to his experimental design. Children born from unauthorized relationships were sometimes removed from their families and reassigned to different groups, or, in cases where Blackwood deemed them genetically undesirable, placed in work roles that prevented them from eventually reproducing. The psychological impact of living under such conditions was severe and documented in testimonies collected after federal authorities finally intervened in 1889. People described living in constant fear of Blackwood's arbitrary decisions, never knowing when they might be separated from family members, forced into unwanted marriages, or have their children taken from them. The plantation had become a laboratory where human beings were reduced to data points in an experiment they had never consented to and could not escape from. By 1880, 13 years into his experiment, Blackwood believed he was seeing results that validated his approach. He had identified what he claimed were heritable traits that were breeding true across generations. He had produced individuals with unusual physical characteristics, including several children with exceptional height, strength, or sensory acuity that he attributed to his selective breeding protocols. He had groups of children who showed enhanced learning abilities that he credited to his early developmental interventions. But these apparent successes came at an enormous human cost that Blackwood simply did not recognize or value. The children he considered experimental triumphs were also deeply traumatized, individuals who had been subjected to invasive procedures, controlled and monitored throughout their development, and raised in an environment where they were valued only for the traits they expressed rather than as complete human beings, worthy of dignity and autonomy. The turning point in Blackwood's experiment came in 1885, when he decided to implement what he called the advanced protocols. He had been corresponding with physicians and researchers in Europe who were exploring radical new theories about human development and enhancement. Some of these theories involved experimental surgeries, others focused on intensive psychological conditioning, and still others suggested that human capabilities could be fundamentally altered through early intervention in ways that went far beyond simple selective breeding. Blackwood began attempting surgical interventions on some of the children in his experimental groups. The details of these procedures, recorded in his surgical log, revealed attempts to modify bone structure, to increase height, to alter muscle attachments to enhance strength, and in several cases, to perform experimental procedures on the skull that Blackwood believed might enhance cognitive function. These surgeries were conducted without proper anesthesia, without sterile techniques, and without any real understanding of whether they would work or what harm they might cause. The results were catastrophic. Several children died from infections following surgery. Others survived, but were permanently disabled by procedures that damaged rather than enhanced their physical capabilities. The psychological trauma of being subjected to such procedures was profound and lasting. Yet Blackwood continued, driven by his conviction that he was on the verge of major breakthroughs in understanding human development, that the suffering he was causing was justified by the knowledge he was gaining. It was during this period of escalating experimentation that people on the plantation began to resist in ways they had not dared to before. Several families attempted to escape, though most were caught and returned. Word began to spread to neighboring plantations and eventually to the broader community about unusual activities at Thornfield. Blackwood's attempts to maintain secrecy were becoming more difficult as the scale and intensity of his experiments increased. In 1887, a woman named Sarah Mitchell managed to escape from Thornfield Plantation with her 3 children. She made her way to New Orleans, where she sought help from a Freedmen's Bureau office that was still operating, though with much reduced authority and resources compared to the immediate post-war years. Sarah told officials about the conditions at Thornfield, about the forced marriages and separations, about the medical experiments being conducted on children, about the deaths and the suffering. Her testimony was initially met with skepticism. The Freedmen's Bureau had heard many complaints about exploitation and mistreatment of black workers in rural Louisiana, and they lacked the resources and authority to investigate every report. But Sarah was persistent, and she was able to provide specific details about Blackwood's operations that were disturbing enough to warrant some level of investigation. Bureau officials forwarded her testimony to U.S. Army authorities, who still maintained a military presence in Louisiana as part of the ongoing Reconstruction administration. The Army was also stretched thin, dealing with widespread civil unrest and the growing resistance of white Southerners to federal authority. But Sarah's account included allegations of systematic medical experimentation on children, which raised concerns that went beyond the routine exploitation that characterized much of the labor relations in the post-war South. A decision was made to send a small military unit to Thornfield Plantation to investigate the claims, and if necessary to remove any children who appeared to be in danger. The unit that arrived at Thornfield on April 12, 1889, consisted of a captain, 2 lieutenants, and 20 enlisted men. They were accompanied by a civilian physician who had been asked to assess the medical conditions on the plantation. Blackwood initially refused them entry, claiming that his property rights protected him from unwarranted federal intrusion. But the commanding officer had authorization to enter by force if necessary, and Blackwood, faced with armed soldiers, reluctantly allowed them onto the property. What the federal troops discovered over the following days would be documented in official reports, medical examinations, and testimony that filled hundreds of pages. The population they found at Thornfield consisted of 63 individuals, ranging in age from infancy to middle age. These people showed a wide range of physical and psychological conditions, many of which appeared to be the direct result of Blackwood's experimental interventions. There were children with unusual physical proportions, their bodies modified by procedures that had altered their normal development. There were individuals who showed signs of chronic poisoning from the substances Blackwood had administered over years. There were people with surgical scars from procedures that appeared to have no legitimate medical purpose, and there were many individuals who, while physically healthy, showed profound psychological trauma from years of living under Blackwood's control. The physician who examined the population was particularly struck by a group of 7 children between ages 8 and 14, who all shared similar unusual characteristics. They were unusually tall for their ages, with elongated limbs and distinctive facial features that set them apart from normal development patterns. When questioned, Blackwood admitted that these children were the result of his most intensive breeding and intervention protocols, that he had selected their parents specifically for certain traits, and had subjected them to various treatments from birth, designed to enhance their growth and development. But the physician's examination revealed that whatever Blackwood had achieved in terms of creating unusual physical characteristics had come at a terrible cost. These children suffered from various health problems related to their abnormal development. Their bones were fragile and prone to fractures. They experienced chronic pain from joints and connective tissues that were under constant stress. Their cognitive development was impaired in ways that suggested damage from the substances Blackwood had given them during critical developmental periods. The commanding officer's initial report described the scene as resembling a medical ward more than a functioning plantation. Many people were ill, several were bedridden, and the overall health of the population was poor despite Blackwood's claims that his experimental protocols were producing superior individuals. The living conditions were Spartan at best, with people housed in structures that were barely adequate for shelter and sanitation. Most damning were Blackwood's own records. The military unit seized his journals and medical logs, finding detailed documentation of 22 years of systematic experimentation. Blackwood had recorded everything, from his initial breeding selections through the various experimental interventions he had performed, to the deaths of dozens of subjects, and his hypotheses about what had caused those deaths, and what adjustments he should make to his protocols. Reading through these journals, the officers came to understand that they weren't dealing with a plantation owner who had simply mistreated his workers, but with someone who had deliberately established a human laboratory, who had treated people as experimental subjects, with no regard for their suffering or autonomy, who had pursued scientific knowledge through methods that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. Marcus Blackwood was arrested on April 14, 1889, and charged with multiple crimes including assault, unlawful imprisonment, and what prosecutors would eventually term crimes against humanity, though that specific legal framework didn't exist in American law at the time. The 63 people found on his plantation were placed under the protection of federal authorities while decisions were made about their care and future. The legal proceedings against Blackwood became one of the most complex and controversial criminal cases in Louisiana history. His defense attorneys argued that he had broken no specific laws, that the people on his plantation had been there voluntarily under labor contracts, and that his medical experiments, while perhaps ethically questionable, were not explicitly illegal under existing statutes. This defense raised troubling questions about the limits of property rights and personal autonomy in the post-war South, about what protections existed for people who were technically free but who remained vulnerable to exploitation by those with power over them. The prosecution countered that while specific laws against medical experimentation might not have existed, Blackwood's actions clearly constituted assault, false imprisonment, and reckless endangerment. They argued that the labor contracts had been obtained through deception and coercion, that the people who signed them had no real understanding of what they were agreeing to, and that even if the contracts had been legitimate initially, Blackwood's subsequent actions had voided any legal authority they might have granted him. The trial, which began in January of 1890, attracted national attention. Newspaper reporters from major cities attended the proceedings, sending daily dispatches about the shocking testimony being presented. Medical experts testified about the harm that Blackwood's interventions had caused. Survivors from the plantation described their experiences under his control. Blackwood himself took the stand to defend his work, arguing that his research had been conducted in the service of advancing human knowledge, that the suffering of his subjects was regrettable but necessary, and that future generations would vindicate his methods, even if his contemporaries condemned them. This defense appalled many observers, but also resonated with certain elements of scientific and medical communities, who believed that the pursuit of knowledge sometimes required difficult choices. There were physicians and researchers who, while not condoning everything Blackwood had done, argued that medical progress often came at a cost, that experimental subjects had always borne risks for the benefit of society, and that Blackwood's error was not in conducting experiments on human beings, but in being too aggressive in his methods and too careless in his selection of subjects. The trial concluded in March of 1890 with a verdict that satisfied almost no one. Blackwood was convicted of assault and unlawful imprisonment, but acquitted of the more serious charges. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but served only 4 before being released on the grounds of ill health. He died in 1896, never expressing remorse for what he had done, and maintaining until the end that his research had been valuable, and would eventually be recognized as pioneering work in human genetics and development. The 63 people rescued from Thornfield Plantation faced uncertain futures. Federal authorities attempted to place them in communities where they might be able to establish normal lives, but this proved difficult. Many had been on the plantation since childhood and had no experience of life beyond Blackwood's controlled environment. Those with unusual physical characteristics found themselves objects of curiosity or fear in communities that didn't understand their conditions. Several of the children who had been most heavily modified by Blackwood's interventions required ongoing medical care that was difficult to obtain in the 1890s. A few individuals managed to build relatively normal lives. They moved to cities where they could find work and some degree of anonymity. They married and had families of their own, though many chose not to have children, fearing that whatever had been done to them might affect their offspring. Others struggled with chronic health problems that stemmed from the experimental procedures they had undergone. Still others were permanently institutionalized, their psychological trauma so severe that they could not function independently. The long-term effects of Blackwood's experiment extended across generations. Children born to the survivors sometimes showed unusual characteristics that appeared to be inherited consequences of the modifications their parents had undergone. Medical researchers who studied these second-generation effects found evidence suggesting that some of Blackwood's interventions had caused genetic changes that were passed to offspring, though the science of the time was not advanced enough to fully understand or document these effects. The case also raised profound questions about medical ethics and the limits of scientific research that would continue to resonate through American history. In an era before institutional review boards, informed consent requirements, or clear ethical guidelines for human subjects research, Blackwood's experiment represented an extreme but not entirely unprecedented example of medical research conducted without regard for the welfare of subjects. The Thornfield case was cited in early 20th century debates about eugenics and selective breeding programs that gained popularity in many states. Some advocates of eugenics pointed to Blackwood's work as crude but directionally correct, arguing that more careful and humane versions of selective breeding could improve human genetic stock. Others cited Thornfield as a cautionary tale about the dangers of treating human beings as experimental subjects, of allowing scientific curiosity to override moral considerations. The medical journals and records seized from Blackwood's plantation were deposited in federal archives, where they remained largely unstudied for decades. When researchers finally began examining these materials in the mid-20th century, they found detailed documentation of procedures and observations that, while ethically abhorrent, contained information relevant to understanding human genetics, development, and the long-term effects of various environmental and medical interventions. This created an ethical dilemma that continues to this day. Should research based on unethical experiments be used, even if that research might provide valuable medical knowledge? If using such data helps future patients, does that partially justify the original harm, or does any use of the data further victimize those who were subjected to unethical treatment? These questions, first raised prominently by the Thornfield case, would recur throughout the 20th century as other examples of unethical medical research came to light. The physical site of Thornfield Plantation went through various transformations after Blackwood's arrest. The property was seized by federal authorities and eventually sold at auction. It changed hands several times over the following decades, with various owners attempting to establish profitable agricultural operations. But the property carried a dark reputation that made it difficult to attract workers or maintain stable operations. By the 1920s, much of the land had been abandoned, with buildings falling into disrepair. In the 1950s, a small historical marker was erected near the site, briefly describing it as the location of medical experiments conducted without consent in the post-Civil War era. The marker was vandalized repeatedly and eventually removed. The local community, which included descendants of some of the people who had been subjected to Blackwood's experiments, was divided about whether and how to commemorate what had happened there. Some argued that the site should be preserved as a reminder of the dangers of unethical science and of the vulnerability of oppressed people to exploitation by those with power over them. Others felt that any commemoration would simply memorialize suffering without providing justice or healing for those who had been harmed. Still others wanted the entire history forgotten, believing that keeping the memory alive only perpetuated pain and stigma. By the early 21st century, almost all physical traces of the original Thornfield plantation had disappeared. The buildings had collapsed or been demolished, the land had been reclaimed by the Louisiana wetlands, and only archival records and scattered historical accounts preserved the memory of what had occurred there between 1867 and 1889. But the descendants of Blackwood's experiment lived on, scattered across the United States, many unaware of the full history of what their ancestors had endured. Some families had preserved oral histories of their time at Thornfield, passing down stories of suffering and survival through generations. Others had deliberately chosen to forget, to start over without the burden of that history, to build new identities untethered from the trauma of the past. In recent decades, as genetic testing has become more accessible, some descendants have discovered that they carry genetic markers suggesting unusual ancestry, modifications that don't fit normal patterns of human genetic variation. These findings have led to renewed interest in the Thornfield case among medical researchers studying human genetics and the long-term effects of environmental modifications on heredity. What they've found suggests that Marcus Blackwood, for all his ethical failures and the harm he caused, may have succeeded in creating heritable changes in some of his subjects, whether through the substances he administered, the procedures he performed, or simply through his selective breeding over multiple generations. Some of the people subjected to his experiment appear to have developed characteristics that were then passed to their descendants. The exact mechanisms remain unclear, but the existence of these multi-generational effects is increasingly well documented. This raises troubling questions about how we should understand Blackwood's experiment in retrospect. If his methods, however unethical, produced results that provide insight into human genetics and development, how do we balance recognition of that scientific contribution against condemnation of the suffering he caused? If descendants of his subjects now carry genetic changes that affect their health or capabilities, do they deserve compensation or special medical care? Who bears responsibility for harm that extends across multiple generations? The Thornfield case also forces us to confront the broader historical context of medical research in America. Blackwood's experiment did not occur in isolation. It was part of a long tradition of medical research conducted on vulnerable populations without their informed consent. Enslaved people had been used as medical subjects before the Civil War. After emancipation, poor people, institutionalized people, and racial minorities continued to be treated as available subjects for research that would not have been conducted on more privileged populations. Understanding Blackwood's experiment requires understanding this larger pattern of exploitation, the ways that scientific curiosity has often been pursued at the expense of those with the least power to resist, and the inadequacy of ethical frameworks and legal protections that might have prevented such abuse. The lasting legacy of the Thornfield experiment is complex and contested. For some, it represents a dark chapter in American medical history, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated research and the importance of strong ethical oversight. For others, it's a reminder of the vulnerability of marginalized populations and the ways that racism and economic exploitation can take on new forms even after formal systems of oppression like slavery are abolished. For the descendants of those who survived Blackwood's experiment, the legacy is deeply personal. Some have devoted themselves to ensuring that the history is remembered, and that lessons are drawn from it. Others have focused on healing and moving forward, choosing not to be defined by trauma that occurred generations ago, and still others continue to grapple with the medical and psychological effects that trace back to those 22 years at Thornfield Plantation. In the end, the story of Marcus Blackwood and his experiment on human subjects in post-Civil War Louisiana is not just about one man's scientific ambitions or ethical failings. It's about the broader question of what limits should exist on the pursuit of knowledge, about who gets to decide what kinds of research are acceptable, and about how we protect vulnerable people from exploitation by those who have power over them. These questions remain relevant today, as medical research continues to advance rapidly, and as we continue to discover that ethical guidelines and oversight mechanisms are not always sufficient to prevent harm to research subjects. The past is never truly buried. In archived documents, in genetic markers passed through generations, in the memories of descendants, and in the continuing debates about research ethics and human subjects protection, the Thornfield experiment continues to shape our understanding of science, medicine, and human dignity. What happened in Louisiana between 1867 and 1889 reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is not an absolute good, that scientific progress cannot justify human suffering, and that societies must maintain vigilant protection of the vulnerable against those who would exploit them in the name of advancement. What do you think about this case? Where should we draw the line between scientific research and human rights? Should Blackwood's data be used if it might help future patients, or would that further victimize those he harmed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries like this every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Hit that like button, share this video, and let us know what state you're watching from. Tomorrow, we'll investigate another case from America's past, where medical science crossed ethical boundaries that should never have been violated. The past is never truly buried. It's just waiting in the shadows.